Hello and welcome to Arvos of Harbour. We're looking at the books that I read in August, which are all of these very big and heavy tomes. Some very interesting mystery books in here. I really enjoyed the way that they used structure and plot and pacing in order to make an interesting story. We'll just start with The Luminaries, which is my Booker Prize winner this month. This is the largest and longest Booker Prize winner, and I went into it thinking it would be more difficult than it actually was. Because it's historical fiction, it's set on the goldfields of New Zealand in the 1800s. I assumed it would be something like Wolf Hall or Possession, something very researched and careful, and it's a mystery story, so it's an astrologically based story where there are 12 characters that creates this council to try and figure out a bunch of weird stuff that's going on. So a woman named Anna has been found in the middle of the town square, seemingly overdosed on opium. A bunch of gold has been sewed into her dress. Meanwhile, a rich prospector named Emery Staines has disappeared. No one really knows where he is or what's happened to him. There's a man named Crosby Wells who's a hermit. He dwells by himself. And he's been found dead by a visiting politician. But in his house is found not just a large sum of gold that have all been stamped with the name of this mine that has previously not produced any gold, but also a deed signed by him transferring money from Emery Staines to Anna. So all of these things are tied up in this strange conspiracy with a man named Francis Carver, who has a scar on his face and seems to be this really villainous figure. So we have these 12 townspeople, each of them are represented by a different one of the zodiac signs, and they together try to figure out what relationship they had with all the people that I've just named, and ultimately what's happened. Whose money is it? Whose money does it belong to? What wrongdoing has been done? The thriller structure works surprisingly well for a book of this length, and finishing it, I would compare it to something like The Secret History or The Shadow of the Wind. I really didn't expect that going in, but it got me real good. So the first chapter section is about 300 pages long, and it details every one of these 12 characters recounting all the information they know about this core mystery. All of them are really distinct. It's one of those great books where there's 20 plus characters, and I can look back at the list of characters at the beginning and realize that I know who each of these people are, and I know what their motivations are, what their personalities are like, and it's just really well constructed. I think the characterization is a real strength of this novel. You really feel the various motivations of these people, and I think it's so interesting looking at Eleanor Catton writing about men in particular, because all her men in this story, all of the 12 are men. They're quite lonely, and they're quite bad at expressing themselves. They feel like they need to withhold a part of their identity, and this ultimately becomes the thing that hides this conspiracy really well, is that they're not just motivated by figuring out what the truth is, they're also motivated by their own personal sense of justice and integrity, and each of them has a different sense of it. All of these men tend to work on certain personal codes, whether it is you must help the less fortunate, or there is a Chinese prospector who's trying to earn 168 pounds exactly so he can bring it back to China. Each of them have these own motivations, and that just ties everything together and makes it so complex. We really feel for these characters, and once I got past the halfway point, which is where the information stops being given and we start unraveling this mystery, I was just reading furiously. I needed to know everything about this, and I was so enraptured by the way the story is constructed, and it's just done really well. I have some reservations about the astrology, so I personally don't know that much about the signs or what these significances are, so I wonder if this novel is a lot better for people who do know about it, because I understand the author has done some star charting and figured out exactly what points the various celestial bodies were in the events of the story, so all of this is mapped to actual dates in the book. I don't get it. And I didn't feel like it was necessary to research each of these to understand the plot, because ultimately the plot is just a complicated heist mystery type plot. I wonder if it would have been more interesting to have known that significance. But I did still enjoy my time with it, and I would still really recommend it. I just think that some of the conclusions in relation to astrology and determinism, I don't know if it fully jives with the way that I like my mysteries to be solved. But, I mean, I support it. I enjoy it. It is a 4 out of 5 for me. Book number 2, my something light, is The Secret History by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is a famous children's novel from 1911, I believe, and I get why it survived this long. So I am trying to finish a reading challenge. It's leading me to some books that I didn't read as a kid and I had to go back to, and I variously disliked most of them. So I'm not a huge fan of children's fiction that looks at the world at a very different period of time and just puts forward these very basic assumptions. I should probably explain what I'm talking about. So, The Secret History is about Mary, who is orphaned at the beginning of the story. She's living in British colonial India, and so she's very used to this lifestyle where there are Indian servants at her house that's raising her and teaching her, whereas her parents are off doing investments or whatever white people did in India. And she, because her parents have passed away, she's then taken to England to live in this big manor, so big that she's not even sure how many rooms are there. She's not sure if there's any kids to play around with there, and she just hates it. She's angry and doesn't like this change of routine and doesn't like the people that she's living with. And I'm just reading this going, I would never know this kind of wealth in my life. Like, the level of ingratitude that I'm seeing from Mary. Like, I get this is the start of the story, and so she's going to transform, she's going to develop as a person. And she is also a child. I can't judge her morality or her attitude, but gosh, it's so annoying to read about a character. And I don't want to say that I grew up disadvantaged, but I also recognize that a lot of people reading children's novels now are not going to relate to what it was like growing up in an advantaged Victorian home. Someone who has not just a estate, but one so big that they don't even know what to do with a lot of it. Yes, these characters have suffered various personal tragedies, but there's a level of luxury that to me is almost going to waste here. And so Mary finds within this building a secret garden, and it's owned by the late wife of the manor's owner. And so because she's passed away, it's gone into disrepair. There's a gardener who's secretly tending it, but aside from that, it's this secret just to her. And this begins to change the way that Mary looks at the world. She becomes more optimistic, and she starts to explore the mansion, seeing what she can find. Ultimately, she finds Colin, who is the son of the manor's owner and Mary's cousin. Colin is a sickly child, and it's not really explained exactly what he has or what his deal is, because he's very convinced that he has a hereditary illness, and he's convinced that he's not going to live very long. And as a result, he has also become a deeply spoiled child. He will not leave his room or his bed, and he will just throw tantrums and make the house's servants do whatever he wants them to do. And everyone's kind of tiptoeing around him because he's the son of the manor's owner, but he comes off also as very, very annoying. And to me, there's a bit of coding of mental illness here, because he speaks in such an unusual way, and he's also got such a predicament about him. But ultimately, the plot of this narrative is that Mary shows Colin the secret garden, and they eventually develop this desire to see it restored, and this return to hope and optimism. And it works. I do like that the book is very uplifting, and when these characters feel joy, the reader does feel that joy as well. And that's a really nice thing when nearly all the other books I read are quite deeply tragic. And we'll get to that. But I forgot by the end of this book that these characters are orphaned. I forgot the sadness from the very beginning, because the happiness that happens at the end is so powerful. And I just wonder if that's a thing that I should admire about a book. Is the point of happiness to forget sadness? Because I didn't feel like Mary really came to terms with being an orphan. Neither did Colin really do much work to recover from whatever it is he had. It just felt like a magical thing that the garden does. And I appreciate that sometimes life is like that something comes our way and nature is powerful, and it doesn't need a big journey of growth and change and challenging ourselves. And it is a children's novel, but I don't know, I just kind of wanted more. I think the children's works that of this reading challenge that I've read that have really got to me have been the ones that reckon with the complexity of adult life and doesn't solve problems as easily as I thought this book solved them. It also could just be that I read it too fast, and I really sped through it because I was so annoyed at what these characters were at the beginning. But yeah, like I appreciate it, I understand it, I get it. It's a 3 out of 5 for me, and there are other works that I would personally give to younger readers before I would give them this one. Book number 3, Something Spooky, is Carrie by Stephen King, my first Stephen King novel. I've never read a full work of his, and it's also his first novel. Everyone knows the story of Carrie, and so this is an interesting example because it's so rare that I open a book and I know every single plot beat that's about to happen before it happens. But so does everyone else. It's such a famous movie and an iconic character. It's about Carrie White, who is a daughter of I wouldn't even say fundamentalist Christian, because it's really like a misinterpretation of Christianity, almost like a doomsday cult type mother who is very repressive towards Carrie's femininity, especially. And because of this, or possibly just because of a recessive gene, no one's really sure, Carrie develops psycho or telekinetic powers, so she can move things with her mind. And she discovers this after a particularly traumatic incident at her school, where also American schools sound dystopian in this book. The idea of communal showers where everyone is making fun of you is just horrific. Does that happen? I would hope that never happens in your life. But anyways, Carrie has her first period in this shower environment, and that leads to all the other girls making fun of her and just throwing sanitary items at her in just the most awful thing. And the teachers at the school are completely oblivious to this as well. Everyone just kind of treats Carrie as a designated victim of torment. And so Carrie goes home and she starts practicing this power. And of course, the most iconic scene is that she's eventually invited to the prom, or the I don't know if they call it prom or just like a dance, something like that. But she's elected the prom queen, and a popular boy is elected prom king. They get up on stage, and a bunch of bullies dump pig's blood on Carrie. Carrie goes crazy and kills them all. This is just... I was even thinking as I was reading this, if I was teaching a high school class or any writing class, and someone came to me with this idea and said, my idea is to write a story about a young girl who's bullied and then gets revenge and kills her tormentors with psychic powers, I would say that's a bad idea and you shouldn't write that. So I find it interesting that the opposite side of the coin would be then to say, this book is written well, so well that it overcomes the limits of its idea. Which I also don't know if I entirely agree with, because I don't think this book is written particularly well. It does consistently interesting things, and I think if given this bad idea, I think it's done enough to make it interesting enough to keep reading. Like, I could keep going. But the way that it's done is odd. So it started off as a short story, and King himself tried to get rid of it, and his wife suggested, hey, maybe you should extend it and make it something work, because King himself wasn't as familiar with writing female protagonists. And so it does feel like a short story that was rescued and elongated. You get these insertions of fake non-fiction. There are books that examine Carrie from a psychological angle. There are books from survivors of the incident recounting what happened on the day. There are police reports. There are news articles. There are all these fake things to make this event seem more real, and that's interspersed with the limited narration that follows Carrie and explains what she's thinking. But these are also intruded by more stream of consciousness sentences that are done in brackets and italics, and they're not capitalized. And so we get more than two, really. We get multiple angles of these characters, how they think and how they behave. And it seems like their psychology is split between what they are actually thinking and doing, and also this deeper carnal uncertainty. Like, when we get these bracket sentences, sometimes we're not even sure who's thinking this. It's interesting. And it still reads very quickly. There's not a lot of events, and so it doesn't take a lot of time to finish. It's quite a short novel as well. I finished it in 2 days. I don't think I'll remember it. It's funny, because there's already a few other novels with this premise that came out around the time this book came out. And there are also lots of movies with this kind of premise. It's just something that's carnally satisfying to viewers, is this idea of getting back at someone's bullies. We see it all the time, and I'm exhausted by it every time I see it. But it's like you can't look away. It's perversely satisfying, in a sense. So I don't really know what to say about this book other than it's a 3 out of 5. I think that it's a historical footnote, and it's something that we probably wouldn't read if Stephen King didn't then go off to become enormously successful. I think one thing that can be learned from Carrie is how to transition from a one-off success to a long-term career in writing. And Stephen King is I don't want to say horrifically, he writes horror, horrifically efficient. He puts out several 1,000+ page novels in a year. And if I was to just read nothing but Stephen King, it would take me more than a year to finish that. There are clubs around the world that study nothing but Stephen King's works, and good on him, right? Like, there's definitely something there that's valuable to everyone that reads his work. And from what I see about, I love the Stephen King content creating community. I love that people will rank his novels and talk about all of them. And Carrie tends to sit in the middle for these types of videos. So I do find it interesting that Stephen King does do more experimental or unusual or just quickly written works, and he also does works that I understand will be remembered for a long time. Was it The Shining, The Shawshank Redemption, novels that are designed to be expressive and lasting. So yeah, Carrie, 3 out of 5, sits in the middle. Book number 4 is my yearly challenge, and I am cheating once again because this is a serialized book that was published sort of in one of the years I'm trying to hit. The Hound of Baskervilles from Arthur Conan Doyle is a Sherlock Holmes mystery, and the third novel-length one that I've read so far. Last year, I tried to make a video that was reading all of Sherlock Holmes, and I read A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of the Four, and I found that I didn't actually like either of those books. I thought the way that the plot twists and the structure was done was just a bit too out there, and I didn't want to make a video that was primarily negative, but I also didn't want to keep reading these books, so I put that aside, and then I came back to read The Hound of Baskervilles, and I was optimistic because everyone seemed to say that this is the best one, and it is good. It is really good. I like the way that the structure for this one does keep the audience guessing, and I think just the little elements of it work to contribute to the whole in a way that's I didn't think was quite as effective with the other earlier novels. So this is primarily a Watson novel. Watson is sent to reside with the young heir of the Baskervilles, Henry Baskervilles, when the owner of the Baskervilles Manor passes away, frightened by the local mystery of a hellhound that haunts this family name. And so Henry is this real naive young man who's... Okay, first of all, when a novel says that a family is rich because of speculation in South Africa, I can't believe that, well, I can believe it, but it's incredulous, though, to me, that a novel will just completely gloss over the moral implications of this. Where if someone says, I mean, today, if someone says, hey, my family's rich because of speculation in South Africa, my first initial assumption is to see they're probably a villain, and to ask, what atrocity did you perpetrate? What atrocity did your ancestors perpetrate? Whereas for this novel, it's just a given. And England as a colonial power is like that, I guess. But sure, we've got this rich family, we've got this house, and we've got Watson trying to investigate what's going on because he doesn't believe in the supernatural. And I think this is one interesting thing that Sherlock Holmes does, is that we can look at these novels as a very concrete transition from a world that believed in the supernatural and superstition to a world which doesn't, and a world which believes in reason and logic and finding realistic explanations for events that would otherwise be supernatural. And so he visits this regional area of England where people do believe in the hellhound. People believe that the moor is haunted. And Watson is there working against that, trying to think, well, I'm someone who is logical and I believe in rationality, and so I'm going to try and find a realistic explanation for this. But Sherlock, meanwhile, is absent. And this is what I think makes this story so strong, is that in the previous novels, Sherlock is the superhero character, is so observant, he can figure out details immediately. And so the tension's kind of gone, because we know that Sherlock will just find the answer. Whereas here, we're waiting for Sherlock. We don't know where he is. We're in a point where Watson is at times in physical danger, and he doesn't want to risk or compromise the investigation. It's just really interesting. the way that they do various clues and various pieces of information, we're given these characters and we're invited to speculate and suspect each of them for what their motivations are. It is the archetypal mystery story, and it works here. And when it works, it really does sing. I think this book does hold up compared to the earlier two works that I've read. I understand why this character is so iconic. I wonder if when people are remembering Sherlock Holmes, they're remembering this story, because there are some real bad ones in the short stories that I guess we just don't talk about anymore. Much more so than just one-off references of speculating in South Africa. But it's good. I think that all parts of it are satisfying, and for me, the mark of a good mystery story is when we can forgive the contrivances and the improbable events that happen. I think that every mystery story kind of has to have them. It can't be the most obvious solution, but the solution that is there needs to be something that makes us think, oh yeah, I can see that happening. And it does fall apart on thinking about it after the fact. I think there are a lot of questions that you can ask of the story where there are no good answers. But as you're reading it, all the answers that you are given are still satisfying. So it is a 4 out of 5. It is very worthwhile to look at the, not origins, but the codification of the mystery genre. I think after this character and these books, the mystery genre became very much solidified into what it is. Book number 5, this is maybe because I don't want to. I am not a fan of Charles Dickens, but there are so many books on this challenge that I need to read through, and Oliver Twist is one of them. Oliver Twist being his second full novel. This is an angry... He was so angry writing it. You can understand, because Charles Dickens didn't grow up well off. He grew up experiencing the negative aspects of the workhouse and of Victorian society for children that didn't have well-off backgrounds. And so he is so mad in this book. He presents us with Oliver, who is an orphan, and he's born into the care of a beadle named Mr. Bumble. A beadle is someone who should be motivated by religious charity, and Mr. Bumble is not. He's a terrible person, and he exploits everyone in his care, but especially Oliver. And so we just read this novel where the first 2/3 of it is just Oliver getting kicked around by life, and that's just it. We see all the people in society being awful to him, and every glimmer of hope is just snatched away in a way that almost makes you want to laugh if Oliver wasn't just crying constantly. Like, I think that nearly every chapter Oliver is crying at some point. I was surprised too, because I thought I knew the plot of this novel going in. It's not like a Carrie situation where I knew exactly what was going to happen, and it happened. I thought this novel was about chimney sweeps. I thought it was about Oliver working as a chimney sweep and then living in this workhouse, and then every night asking if he can have some more. I didn't expect to not get that. So the whole, like, living in the workhouse and asking for more is, like, in the first couple of chapters. And then he never actually does work for the chimney sweep. A chimney sweeper tries to buy him for labor, and Mr. Bumble says no. So really what this book is about is Oliver runs away, and he is found in the care of this group of thieves led by this Jewish man named Fagin. And it's a bunch of child thieves led by a kid named the Artful Dodger. The Artful Dodger is also a British garage duo, and they have a song called Rewind featuring Craig David that was stuck in my head the entire time I read this stupid book. Oliver, however, is born with a conscience, and so he's not very good at stealing. And when he does try it, he's constantly thrown under the bus by the Artful Dodger and the other kids who are good at stealing. He eventually finds himself in the care of Miss Maylie, who is, he finds nice people. This is a novel which seems to divide nice people and mean people, and nice people are always nice and mean people are always mean. There is no kind of moral challenge to this book. It's not a book about whether Oliver is ever going to be good or bad. It is instead discussed that some people are good and some people are bad. And good people can't be corrupted by badness, like Oliver. And bad people would respond poorly to goodness, which is what Mr. Bumble seems to think, and what a friend of one of the people who is nice to Oliver seems to think. Like, if you spoil a rotten child, they will stay rotten. It feels wrong for me to say this book is bad, but it is shallow, is how I would put it. It's not surprising. and instead it seems to try and elicit rage out of the reader because of how angry the writer is. And there are some really interesting points in here about economics that I think are very ahead of its time. I think an interesting point that's made about charity is that some people who refuse to give out charity give the excuse that if you are charitable towards people who need charity, then they will become addicted to it or they will not learn how to fend for themselves, which is exactly the argument people use today to argue against minimum wage and welfare. The fact that we haven't seemed to solve that is really sad, because even in the 1800s, Charles Dickens could understand, like, that's a ridiculous argument. People who need charity should get charity. And the lack of that becomes the main conflict of this novel. It's not a book that changes you, it's just a book that makes you angry. And the fact that the Victorian society could read a novel like this, and I understand that Dickens was quite instrumental in a lot of societal reforms. I do like the way that his work, and also his own personal campaigning, did change labour conditions within Victorian England and create empathy for people like Oliver. That's great, that's great. But also reading a book like this is just such a frustrating experience. And I can't believe that this book is now one of the default novels. Like, when someone's studying English in a movie, it's a high likelihood that they're either reading Shakespeare or Oliver Twist. It's not one of Dickens's best, and if anyone says that their favourite Dickens novel is Oliver Twist, I would be confused and surprised. I also have to mention too that Fagin is a really bad anti-Semitic stereotype. I was expecting it because I knew about Fagin, I knew about this part of the novel, I knew that there would be anti-Semitic undertones, but I was still floored by just how relentless it is. That Fagin is a character who has no redeeming qualities, and this is linked, the lack of redemption is linked to his Jewishness, as if by default he's expected to be morally bankrupt and also physically repulsive, and that's just constantly referred to all the way through the text. It's also seemingly not a criticism of Fagin's religion as much as it is his race, and this is now beginning an uncomfortable through line, which I've also recognized in other Dickens novels. He does not like foreigners, and he's really unkind towards them. And as a reader, I'm someone who just doesn't like this sense of binary morality. Like, of course I don't like racism, but I also don't like portraying worlds where people are either default good or bad. And so a book like Oliver Twist, it just doesn't speak right to me. So I understand the historical significance, and I would give it a 3 out of 5, but I really didn't like the experience of reading it. And if it weren't for some silly challenge that rates Charles Dickens as one of the greatest writers of all time, and that all his works are worth reading and must be read to be accomplished, or whatever that means, then I wouldn't keep reading him. I can find redeeming things about it, I certainly can. But I can also call out the things that I don't like about it, and there's a lot that I want to call out here. My Shakespeare play this month is Henry VI Part 1. Now, there comes a point in every Read All the Shakespeare's Plays challenge where you gotta read the bad ones. Henry VI Part 1 is a bad play, and pretty much all the scholars agree on it. It's often among the candidates for the worst Shakespeare play. Some of the other ones are at least interesting. So something like Titus Andronicus is objectively a bad play, but it is also kind of interesting in the way that it's ultra-violent and just horrifically mean to its characters. Whereas a play like Henry VI Part 1, the main complaint I have about this play is that there's a very interesting story at its core, and the play doesn't make it interesting. It is something very frustrating to me. So the story of this play is that Henry V, who is a beloved English ruler and really warlord, so he's led this campaign into France. He's convinced his country of this bogus claim that they have over France. And so he's led the English people in an invasion mission and created this strong sense of patriotism. And so everyone loves him, but he's passed away in this war due to sickness. And so Henry VI ascends the crown at the age of, I think, like 10 months or something. Like, it's a tiny little kid. And because he's a kid, he needs someone called a Lord Protector to do the kingly duties until he's ready to rule. We start this play with this infant king, and immediately, now that Henry V is dead, England's control over France is loosening. And so we have this conflict where the various leaders need to continue the fight and continue the campaign into France, even when the French are putting up a pretty good opposition. And so this is the Shakespeare play where Joan of Arc appears. And her representation in this play is fascinating. So she's presented as this young girl who effectively emasculates the King of France, or the Dauphin of France. She takes the rule of the army. She shows herself as stronger physically, like she beats him in a sword fighting duel. And then she consults with demons and spirits in a very Lady Macbeth kind of way. And all of this is Shakespearean trope to say she's evil. She's the villain of this play. This is not what we expect of a literary representation of Joan of Arc, because she's been vindicated by history. She is the representative of the underdog. And so to have a play where the underdog's actually the villain, and England is right to make this ridiculous claim for France, and they should win this war, it's just weird, it's just odd. But as this is going on, there's various factioning among King Henry VI's court. So different people show loyalty to different elements of the landowners, I guess. And there's different families, and this is where the War of the Roses effectively begins, is that we see in one scene some characters take up a red rose to show loyalty to one side of the family, and some characters take up a white rose to show loyalty to the other side. This conflict just will get bigger and bigger until eventually we get to Richard III and everyone's usurping each other. But here, we just get the beginning of it. The most interesting part of this play is with Talbot, who is this general, and he's fighting against Joan of Arc. These scenes to me play out like an action movie, and I think that they're quite fun. We get characters trying to storm into the base, go behind enemy lines, disable cannons. Like, it's just, to me, it feels like this action movie. You have betrayals and all of this cool stuff. And then we go to the court scenes where people are infighting and making speeches at one another, and it's just not that interesting. I also think because the main political argument here in this play is about birthright, so we start to see a question of Henry VI's right to rule and the rise of Richard York, who has a competing claim to the throne because of other hereditary blood. And that's just not that interesting. I find that when Shakespeare's histories gets to Henry IV, and it's later in his career, he makes interesting arguments about the right to rule based on character. So, are you a good leader? Are you eloquent? Are you good at military command? Are you good at being in touch with the common person? All of these things are still questions of leadership that we are talking about today. Maybe not military command, but everything else, right? Is the idea that a leader should be a man of the people. A leader should be altruistic and should be able to control a complicated situation. And that's just not in this play. This play is entirely about who deserves to lead based on who the parents are, and that's just kind of boring, especially today. I think maybe in Shakespeare's day it might have been more interesting because there were questions about succession after Queen Elizabeth, but that's just not that interesting to me. And it also means that the poetics of the speeches are less interesting because you've got to insert these big long names into the meter rather than making more lasting and thematic speeches about personal attributes. So Henry VI Part 1, pretty bad play, 2 out of 5. No one will really watch it or read it, and it's a bit sad to me because I actually really love Henry VI Part 3. I think that's really cool. What was confusing to me too was that there's a lot of characters who are named based on their title in this play. There's lots of dukes and earls, and it's confusing to know first names and last names and titles. It's also confusing to remember when in history this play happens, because Henry VI starts the play as a little kid, but he gets older as the play goes on. There is no chorus or narrator to say what year it is, and there is a point in the middle of the play where Henry VI himself is trying to calm down the disagreements in his court, and he speaks his eloquent speech about how we should all get along and look at each other for what we believe in. And how old is he? Like, is he 5? Is he 10? Is he 12? He's not old. What business does he have speaking like this? The main hubris that this character is going to have all through this trilogy is that he's just too nice. He's too nice of a person. And Shakespeare seems to struggle with this notion, because Shakespeare's good at creating a tragic hero and a tragic villain. He's good at showing qualities that lead to people's downfall in a moral sense. He's good at making moral judgments. But Henry VI, it's not a morally bad thing to be nice. And so how are we going to make an interesting plot about a character who loses control of his kingdom because he tries to be conciliatory towards everyone in his court, even when amongst them they have disagreements? Like, we see the main conflict arising in this play is that Henry VI can't control the infighting of his court because he doesn't want to pick a side. He doesn't want to say, you are going to be on my team and you are going to be banished. Instead, he keeps trying to sit in the middle and assume that most people don't like to conflict with one another. And he's just wrong here. So it could have been so interesting. And yet it's not really in the play at all. And the parts that are in the play are confusing because of these character names. I was often Googling and on Wikipedia trying to figure out who these figures are, who their names are. And I get that because the history of play, Shakespeare doesn't need to put all these people in there because people watching this play are able to trace the lineage to these characters. But it's just, it could have been so interesting and it's just not, and it was so frustrating to read. Also, Henry VI Part 1 has one of the silliest lines of Shakespeare I've ever read. There's a character who discovers the death of Talbot and is racked by grief. He confronts Joan of Arc, he confronts the person who killed him, and says, "Oh, were mine eyeballs into bullets turned, that I in rage might shoot them at your faces." It's one of the most serious scenes in the play, and that's one of the funniest lines I've ever read. But reading through all of these articles, one thing I did notice is that people aren't sure if Henry VI Part 1 or Part 2 is the play that was written first. We know they were both very early Shakespearean plays written around the 1590s, but there's a theory that Henry VI Part 1 is actually written after Richard III. So the original trilogy is Henry VI Part 2, then Part 3, then Richard III, and then he went back and wrote a prequel. It's almost like trying to figure out the silly Marvel movies and which one came where. I, for some reason, decided to weigh in on this. And I knew that if I wanted to do that, I would need to read Part 2 immediately. So Henry VI Part 2 is just the same play again. It's just as uninteresting and just as unstructured and convoluted as the first play. And this time, Henry is a bit older. At the end of Part 1, there was a sequel hook where Margaret of Anjou, who is a queen with ties to France, was brought by Lord Suffolk to marry Henry VI and end the war between England and France. In doing so, Henry VI has signed a terrible trade deal. He's given back lots of territory that he previously won by force, and understandably, he's made the soldiers and the leaders and the knights who sacrificed their own resources to try and claim this land, he's pissed them off really, really bad. Meanwhile, Margaret is being still tied to Suffolk. There's this kind of underhanded relationship. It's not truly clear what they are, but she's not entirely loyal to Henry either. She's not there to help him. And so we have Mr. Nice Guy Henry VI, who is just losing complete control of his court. Meanwhile, we've got Richard York, who's finally starting to mount his campaign against the crown, but he's a bit unsure if he wants to do it right now, and so he enlists Jack Cade. And Jack Cade marches against the crown in order to create the dramatic climax of this play, and it's just such an anti-climax. I was so disappointed, because we have this revolt against the throne, and people who are loyal to Henry go down, they talk to the crowd, and they realize the crowd don't actually care who they fight for, because they ask, who are you loyal to? They say, the king, the king. And then they ask Jack Cade, why are you marching against the king? And Jack Cade is just not eloquent enough to get people on his side. And so this uprising is unsuccessful, and it's in the play, of course, because of historical necessity. But it fizzles out. And the much more interesting uprising is going to happen in the next play, in Part 3. And so the viewer's left with this thought of, why are we watching this? What's the point? What's interesting about this play? The problems that are faced by Henry in Part 2 are the same that he faced in Part 1 and also in Part 3. The claim to the throne by Richard of York is again exhaustingly hereditary. It's exhaustingly about lineage. I'm not going to try and look up all these names to see who has a better claim to the throne. I'm more interested in who's going to be a better leader, because that's a assessment of human qualities that's still relevant to readers today, and that's just not in this play. It's so frustrating. It's, again, like a very good story that's been wasted. And we even have the same kind of consorting of spirits subplot. So the Lord Protector's wife is, again, this Lady Macbeth-like character who consorts with spirits and then gets herself banished because Elizabethan audiences don't like that. Eventually, Shakespeare does become a good author. But these are plays from before that. So 2 out of 5. I also thought about which one came first, and I came to the conclusion of it doesn't actually matter. Because I found it interesting, the argument that Henry VI Part 1 could have been the first one is because it's the worst one. That Shakespeare progressively gets better as an author, and thus his worst play is probably his first. But I would also say that these two are kind of equally bad. I think they have differing qualities. Part 1 is better paced, it has more action, and it's more fun, but it has worse speeches, whereas Part 2 does have some interesting speeches, but the pacing is just a mess. It's all over the place. Characters are randomly fighting each other, there's all these factions that are hard to follow, and neither of them at the end of the day really mean anything. Whereas I think when we get to Part 3, that's a play where there are consequences for actions, and there are discussions about what makes a good leader and a good person, how those two things are very, very different concepts. There is more tragedy and pathos in Part 3 that unfortunately we just didn't get in either of these first two plays. And so I would give both of them a keen skip. Don't read them, don't watch them. And my Because I Wanted To, this is Translations by Jumaana Abdu, a recommendation from a friend, and shortlisted for the Seller Prize in 2025. This is one of the most remarkable books I've read in a long time. I find myself as something of a scanner when I read quite quickly, and sometimes a book comes along that actually forces me to slow down, and I got this on around page 4 of the novel. You can find the passage. Land is older than man, and man is older than a house, and it is difficult to conceive that anything that did not exist at the dawn of things can possess spiritual power, in the sense that all things supernatural must have always been possible, rather than invented along the way. And yet a house is power. It entombs and excavates man, where it becomes an extension of the land, a fertile outgrowth that gestates and propagates man. Anything that can invite or exile, incarcerate or release, that can be locked and unlocked, that can rot and be embalmed, that can be reincarnated and rebuilt, that can be pregnant with emptiness and then overfull, that can possess and be possessed, and be a possession in itself, has life, has purpose, has law. I can't read that quickly. I need to... When the first time I hit that paragraph, I thought, oh, hold on. I didn't get everything of that. And I went back and read it again, and then I went back and read it again. And I feel like the way that I read this book is very, very similar. Constantly going too fast, needing to slow down, and then going back to where I started, and really trying to squeeze out what was really being said, and enjoying the rhythm and the pace of the sentences as well. Everything is just so rich and well constructed. And to me, that's not really how I read often. Like, it needs a very special book for me to do that. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity and decided to do that with this, because this book is a painful read. We follow Alia, who is a Palestinian Australian who has been recently separated from her partner and has a young daughter named Sakina. They moved to a regional area of New South Wales in order to start a new life. She purchases a farmstead and hires a man named Shep to help. Shep is also incredibly closed off as a person. He serves as a religious leader in the region. Together they take on the work of trying to restore the house, but also having quite differing attitudes towards faith and community and raising Sakina and having a relationship with the people around her. Meanwhile, 2 days a week, Alia is also a nurse at the local hospital. She meets Billy and her family, who are Gamieldien people. This novel does function as a solidarity story between Palestinians and First Nations Australians. It discusses ideas of land and possession and about historical and current injustices that are being faced by both people groups. At times it is very theoretical, and I think this complicated writing style functions because you're not changing the pace of your reading as you read. It's either that you're reading very slowly to try and glean the complexity of the conversation, or you're reading very slowly to understand the vaster political and spiritual implications of some of the things that are being said. So it took me about 2 weeks to read this properly. I would sit down for a 20-minute reading session and read about 10 pages. It would really need me to pay my full attention 100% of the time in order to get through this. And I respect that. I respect when a book requires that of a reader. I don't necessarily want that of every book, but when there's a desire to make the reader slow down, and that desire is backed with just as much complexity as this book has, I admire. I think it's a really, really well done exploration of people and identity and culture and all of these things. But it is a very hard read, and I find that Alia is such a closed-off character. Her attitude towards all the people around her is guarded, and she controls her language that she uses very carefully. Many of the characters in the text are like this, and so I often find that when reading conversations and dialogue, it's not so much what is said, but why it's being said and what's being withheld. So every sentence has 3 layers of meaning. It's so exhausting to read, because after every page or chapter, I really need to think to myself, but what's the significance there? And it would be foolish of me to leave things on the surface and not plumb the depths when there's clearly so much going on. I also find so interesting at the end of each chapter, it doesn't necessarily lead you into the next chapter as much as it does force you to recontextualize the things that you've just read, to think and to meditate on these people that have so much depth. Jumaana Abdu has a background in medicine, and I find that there's a deep observation of people in this style of writing, that we really get to understand people, why they are the way they are, and to suffer along with them, to see that the choices they've made in their life, or the person that they've become, the attitudes that they have, force them into situations that are painful and have exit points that people will just not take. I think it's so well written and well done, and I almost don't want to recommend it to people for how much, I don't want to say suffering, but like, there's a definition of compassion as suffering alongside somebody, and when you experience compassion in a novel, it does feel like that. It does feel like you're giving part of yourself to the work, and also part of yourself to the kinds of people in the world that are being represented in books like this. It hurts to read. It hurts to live alongside that and to take on the pain of other people. And the way that this book manages to do that with just words is fantastic. And so that is a clear 5 out of 5. One of those getting teary in the office kinds of books. But I really needed to read something different after this. Learned Behaviours by Zeynab Gamieldien is my other because I wanted to. This is a book by a friend in my writing life, and I really appreciate the way that her work is very grounded and very everyday, and it shows characters existing in different spheres and having to engage and challenge with these various conflicting identities. So her first novel, The Scope of Permissibility, was about Muslim students' associations at universities and about people who are from different ethnic backgrounds but shared faith, and how they come together and the various roles they play within faith and culture, and that weird territory between commonality and difference force people into interesting conflicts. And so Learned Behaviours is a fairly straightforward thriller story. I remember hearing her talk about Agatha Christie, and this book does function as a core murder mystery. We have Zaid, who is studying to be a barrister in Sydney, when the sister of his friend from high school in Western Sydney comes with a diary, and he's forced to relive this period of his life where his friend in high school was accused of murder of a girl from a school nearby. The kinds of assumptions that were made by himself and police and family of everyone involved have to be reassessed from these diary entries. And it could have been quite a harrowing read. And what I find quite surprising about Agatha Christie's work is that, yes, people die, but you don't feel the weight of death. Instead, it's more so about finding out the truth and finding out what happened and giving a sense of justice to events that have happened in the past. It's not necessarily fun, but it is surprising, and it does say more about the kinds of people that were involved in these kinds of situations. And so we have this murder mystery that's set within the divide of Western Sydney and big city money-making legal enterprise. We have this character who's stuck between both, and he's choosing between the various masks and identities that he needs to play as a son of South African migrants, as a friend to a Lebanese Australian who was discriminated against at school, and as someone who's entering a very old money, white legal profession. These things are really interesting, and they're pushed along really quickly by this mystery plot. So The Scope of Invincibility is a novel that I liked because it gave the reader space to kind of dwell in friendships and just see characters interact with one another. And that doesn't really exist in this book because we're constantly interested in this murder and what happened. It jumps back and forth between past and present. We have scenes of high school life in early 2000s Sydney, and we have scenes in the modern day with Ziad in his legal profession. We have this really fast pace because at the end of each chapter, we want to know what the next one's going to be about. And every chapter gives us an additional tool or clue to use in reading the next one. Very similar to my reading of The Hound of Baskervilles, in that as you read, you just get more and more pieces. You get more diary entries, you get more assumptions about characters, you reassess information that you got previously, and you're trying to solve the case. It works really well as a mystery story. And in order for that to work, I find that the more political undertones of identity and culture in this novel are at the surface. I find that there are sentences that very clearly explain why characters are the way they are and why they believe what they do, because the more important part of that chapter is to keep the pace going along and keep the reader interested in the mystery. All of this is tied together very neatly, but it is a book that's trying to be very, very, very many different things. And it's trying to be cozy, and it's trying to be something that you can read very quickly. And I did read this very quickly. In contrast with translations, I read this in a day and a half. And I really appreciate that I was able to do that because, yes, it's about things I'm interested in. It's about a city that I'm from and about things that I have seen in the past. Maybe, well, I haven't seen a murder, but I have seen discrimination and I have seen assumptions made by people for their culture and religion and how that impacts and impedes people's ability to succeed within the workplace. And there's also a very interesting tension of people from refugee or migrant backgrounds being asked to participate eventually in a system that previously excluded and discriminated against them in order to perform well in the economy in Sydney. I think that's such an interesting conflict, and I think it's a good thing that is an undercurrent in this book that the mystery plot can kind of sell to readers. I think people that draw upon this book as a mystery novel then gets an interesting conflict that goes alongside it. And I have that to say as a compliment, but I also have to recognize that this is not a work like translations. And I briefly planned when reviewing this to compare it a little bit, but I don't know if I want to do that because I don't want to compare these books based on the fact that they're both about Muslim Australian characters or about themes. The interesting thing for me is that both these books, plot-wise, have this back and forth between past and present. They both have scenes of schooling in Sydney and how these schooling experiences affect the people becoming quite closed off and reserved in their adult years. But really the big difference between these books for me is the way that I read them and what they do to me as a reader. One, translations being very reflective and demanding a lot from me, demanding my attentiveness and my compassion and asking me to really feel what these characters are feeling. And one in Learned Behaviours, which functions as a mystery and functions as a kinetic story that allows me to recognize the patterns of life that these characters inhabit, but never really be them or never really need to suffer what they suffer, and be able to close the book a little bit more enlightened, but also entertained. Like, translation is not a book that is interested in entertaining the reader at any point, and I was very, very tempted to just stop reading because I didn't need to. I was interested and I was invested, but I wasn't positively uplifted. So a lot of the chapters are kind of beating the reader down with impossibility. Whereas Learned Behaviours, yes, it's about similarly difficult situations, but there's a draw of finding the truth and a draw of righting what was once wrong that makes me want to keep reading to the end. And in that sense, they're very, very different books. I don't necessarily want to say they belong on different shelves, but I would recommend both to people and to read both at the same time and to see how this similar problem or similar concerns can present themselves in different kinds of stories. and that both are really valuable for different reasons, for different kinds of readers. I had a good time. Ultimately, I had so much more to think about, and I feel like I've been enriched by reading these together, which I know that sounds very high school syllabusy of me, but that is what fiction is for, right? That is something I'm very glad that I was able to enjoy. Yeah, thank you for joining me with these books. I am very glad to be able to finally put this Charles Dickens anthology to rest. I can't believe I've read all 4 in this book. We'll be back next month with more books, and I will see you next time.